Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us for one or more of the other events in the series, and welcome to anybody who's joining us for the first time on this topic. And I'm Christine Valenza-Shin, class of '84, Senior Associate Director for our Advising and Programs team. And those of you who were here last week had the pleasure of hearing my colleague Alexa Hamill present on interviewing, and from all reports that went well, and hope you found it enjoyable and informative as well. But now I'm back. I missed you. Don't know if you missed me, and we'll get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and jump into our topic for today. Oop, hold on one second. Let me jump ahead. Great. Okay. So today's topic is, I forgot the little disclaimer ahead of time that we're in webinar mode, so your voice and image won't be shared, but if you want to ask questions in the Q&A section, those can be shared and read aloud, and comments as well. Oh, hold on. The dog is needing to come in. One sec. And I'm back. And I'm back with my summer colloquium holding page. We're down to the last few weeks of summer colloquium, and just want to take a moment to thank all of you for being part of the conversation this summer. We've had a lot of different events, from panels to workshops to speakers to all sorts of to graduate school focus, and as well as this series, and it's been a pleasure to have you take part in the larger conversation that we've had this summer. And I got fancy, a little motion in our nature, take a moment and pause moment. I find it both soothing, and then it makes me a little dizzy if I look too long. So our topic today is negotiation, which can be a tricky one. So let's start with a poll, just so I can get a sense of your experience, your feelings around the topic. Lacey will launch that in just a second, or maybe she has and I can't see it. Ah, there we go. So take a second and answer that if you're willing. Responses are anonymous. With 80% of the vote in, I have to say your answers to number one are fairly typical. The research is pretty clear on the fact that a lot of people have negative or anxiety or stress associations with negotiation, and that seems statistically to be particularly true among women for a variety of reasons. And there's certainly been a lot of work done on this in the last decade plus, and some progress has been made. But as the researchers dig in, and as more women try and put practices, start practicing negotiating, there's things are nuanced, and there's been pushback on some parts of it. So it's a complicated issue, but it's one that knowledge, more skills, more information around it, as well as more practice, has been shown to be really helpful in terms of people making progress. So great. So you all can see the poll results, and then we've got some people in the, so that's good. More people in, yeah, sorry. So mostly negative. Then we've got some people in the neutral camp. And then that's good. I think the never number would have been a little higher if we were talking, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I do think more people have gotten comfortable. So That's great. Okay, good. So now we're sort of knowing where we're coming from. And okay, great. All right. So I'm going to shut that down and go on. All right, so we looked at gut reaction, we looked at your experience level. And I was doing a similar presentation for students a couple weeks back and looked up some definitions, and there were the highly legalistic ones that kept using the word negotiate to define itself. But I liked these two. I thought it was interesting. And it goes to some of the anxiety and some of the negative feelings around this topic, which is why I highlighted agreement and beneficial outcome, but also conflict, because I think part of the negativity around this is and the research has shown that women tend to view this more through a fear of conflict, the idea that negotiation is a contest where there's a winner and a loser, and that increases the anxiety and can kind of freeze up the actual act of negotiating. So that's something we want to think about, this sort of more broader idea that you are talking, you're trying to reach an agreement, you're trying to reach a beneficial outcome. And the outcome doesn't have to be beneficial for one person and negative for the other. It can be beneficial for both, or it can be a mixture. So trying to think a little bit more holistically. And then I wanted to talk a little bit, we'll sort of thread this throughout, but talk a little bit about negotiating in a challenging job market. And as I was, going through and updating this presentation for this series about job search in a crisis and this particular economic moment we're living through, it's finding this balance between pragmatism. We need to be honest about the fact that we went very quickly, probably within a couple of days, from an employee's market to an employer's market, almost overnight. So there are fewer jobs, there's simple supply and demand. There are fewer jobs available for a larger number of people seeking, and that shifts the power to the employers, allows them to be pickier, allows them to, in the case of our topic today, to be stingier. And sometimes that's by, sometimes I say allows them to, but it also, in many cases, makes it necessary for them. There's a lot of hiring freezes going on, both formal and informal, in the sense that with so much uncertainty, there's a lot of companies, organizations just not moving forward, even if they haven't officially made it a policy. And of course, many nonprofits, higher ed, as well as private companies are cutting back on budgets, cutting back in general. So from a pragmatic point of view, it's a tough market to negotiate in, but I'll argue throughout. So part of what I'll do today is talk about general best practices for negotiating, and we'll talk a little bit about how that might be modified a little bit. But our philosophy here, as it has been through the whole series, is that best practices are best practices no matter what the job market is, and understanding what the best, effective ways of going about things is going to help you no matter what. But these things are nuanced. And there is with the anti-racist movement, particularly, I think that continued salary inequities are still on they're not being ignored, they're on people's radar. And so where normally in an economic retraction, there might be some backing away from some of this, I think that there's continuing to be advocacy, both collectively and individually, around salary inequities for women, for people of color. And then again, balancing pragmatism and advocacy. Even if you were to ask for a raise or to try and negotiate for a higher offer than you're receiving, even if you get a no and you choose to take the job anyway or stay in your job, something to think about, whether you articulate it at the moment or just make a note to yourself, is to make a plan for revisiting this. One of the things that can happen during downtimes is that salaries can go down and then things improve, and either people forget or they don't feel comfortable about going back and talking and saying, okay, now that things are better, now that business is improved, let's talk about the raise I didn't get a year ago or 2 years ago. So keeping both in mind, we need to be pragmatic in this era, but also continue to advocate and empower ourselves around these issues. So with those preliminary thoughts aside, let's look at some of what we're going to go over today. We're going to start with the researching question and then go to how salary issues and negotiating comes at various stages. So in general, salary questions are arising earlier in the process than they used to. So we'll talk about some specific strategies for handling that. And then the more classic negotiating is once an offer has been made and the back and forth from there. And then we want to definitely look at future opportunities to negotiate, especially given what I just said about, our current COVID reality and economic challenges that we want to be keeping in mind, what can be coming down the road. But this first point, I just want to stop here. I should have made a separate slide for it, but I'll just give you my spiel. This idea that that the job seeker or the employee is the one in charge of researching salary ranges, I just want to stipulate that this is crazy. Employers know their salaries that they're offering. They know their salary ranges. They know what they want to offer. They know how high they're willing to go. For some reason, I'm sure people have written about and researched this, the culture around salary negotiation, particularly in our country, has evolved that somehow this is a big mystery. And it's something that the employer knows and the applicant or employee has to figure out. So a lot of what we're going to talk about over the next couple slides, methods for researching, is based on this ridiculous reality that somehow we have to do this guessing game. So I just want to stipulate to that and say the culture is somewhat changing, and I encourage all of you to individually and collectively advocate for more transparency and move away from this idea that we all have to do this research and do this guessing and be more open. But again, back on the pragmatic side, given how things are, we're going to talk a little bit about how important it is to do this salary research and salary education. Okay, so let me make sure. Okay, so the title, going back to our title, Know Your Worth, this is absolutely key to the process. And regardless of what I just said about the ridiculousness, the non-ridiculous part of it is that we should all be thinking about this, thinking about what makes us valuable. And the simple formula, although it's got its tricky steps to it, but the basic formula is you want to find the market rate for the job you're looking for, and then you add to that your skills and experience, and together those two things equal your worth. So when our whole goal for today is to have you thinking about knowing your worth, knowing what to ask for, and here's our simple formula, but let's break it down a little bit. Oops, we skipped a slide in here somewhere. Okay, so just breaking down the two concepts, market rate. So the basic question you're trying to figure out is this. That last part is important, because salaries vary for the same type of companies within the same industry from region to region. For those of us who are here in New York, San Francisco, other major cities tend to have higher cost of living and higher salaries and lower elsewhere, but it's important to keep that as part of it. And then your worth, the question you want to ask there is, how do your skills and experience levels compare to the job description first, and then others in the job? When I was talking to the students, I particularly emphasized looking more to the job description than others in the job. It's really hard to gauge when you're, a brand new graduate. There's a feeling that you don't have skill and experience, which of course they do, but they can get really tripped up on but someone else would be so much better or has so much more experience or internship. So you want to definitely look at both, not just, and it's also hard sometimes to compare. You don't necessarily know about others in the job. So how do you do this research? How do you find out this market rate? So we're going to look at online resources. Right. So there are salary finders online, which are often people's first stopping point. And these can be good for general, sort of gathering general information, getting a ballpark figure. But one thing you have to keep in mind is they really vary widely, because a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of these are based on people reporting. So there's a sample bias, as they say. And then different titles and different organizations, like the titles mean different things, so there can be a lot of variation here, but it's not a bad place to start. They take different approaches. Glassdoor is sort of a crowdsourcing thing. I think it's PayScale, actually has you fill out a little profile and then they, give you information back. LinkedIn Salary Insights is interesting. It's also partially self-reported, and you can get one free year of LinkedIn Salary Insights if you are willing to share your title and salary. So it's that trade-off. So you give them your information in exchange for them sharing what they've learned from others. So that can be a place to start. But some other sometimes less obvious places. In the nonprofit sector in particular, there is a website that the PNP staffing group does an annual salary report. Usually comes out in March. And when last I checked, they had them for New York, Philadelphia, and DC. I'm not sure if they've expanded that. For a while there, it seemed like they were expanding to different cities each year. So it's definitely worth a look. And I think basically if you put in the way you get the report is you put in your email and they send it to you almost automatically. And what's helpful about it is they give salary information that's based on surveys according to the annual budget of the organization. So it's helpful in terms, one of the variations in all of this is how small or large an organization is, and that can really have an impact. So that can be really helpful. And then when you compare that to guidestar.com, where you can find out that information about nonprofits, what their annual budget is, then you can put those specific pieces of information together if you're looking at a specific nonprofit, and that can help. Another good resource is if you belong to a trade group or a professional association. If you don't, you might want to look into it, because one of the benefits, they do generally have a fee attached, but one of the benefits is access to annual salary surveys. And because, again, anytime you do a survey and rely on people to report, there's some limitation to that, but people do tend to respond to these in somewhat higher numbers than they do in some of the more general open ones. There are some postings that actually list salary information. So one thing you can keep an eye on is, as you're applying to things, as you're, keep an eye on that. Sometimes, for the most part, there's not a ton of salary information, but sometimes there is. Some places are being more transparent. And then one area where it's legally required that salaries be published is government salaries. So if you go to usajobs.gov, even just for the sake of comparison, you may not be planning on working for the government, but because you can look at similar positions there. The general rule of thumb is that the government pays more than nonprofits and less than the private sector, but that's a very general rule of thumb. But it can be helpful, in this detective project of trying to figure out what a particular position pays. But then another important part of salary research is to ask actual people. Okay, so it's definitely something that you can do in a networking setting. We talked a lot about networking a couple weeks ago. I wouldn't lead with this necessarily, but if you've had a good productive conversation, and particularly if you have been talking about what types of roles in their company or their industry might be a good fit, here's a couple of simple scripts of finding out what people know. And it really varies. I find that some people know a ton about salaries and what people are being paid in their organization, and some people either don't know or just are sort of hands off about it. But asking in these sort of general ways it can't hurt, and you could get some good information back. So just doing that simple ask can be helpful. Another group of people who know a fair amount about salaries and what's being offered are recruiters, headhunters, HR people in general. if you're working directly with a recruiter and they're part of the negotiation process, that's not necessarily what I'm looking for, although you absolutely can ask them. One of our mantras through this session is always ask first. But this could also be just speaking to recruiters in a more general sense. So as you're, again, networking, or if your existing network, asking around, have you worked with a recruiter, anybody you can recommend, and just asking for, it's almost like having an informational interview with a recruiter, which can be a little tricky to get, but you would be trying to pick their brain a little bit about salary. Right. And then if you are, actively applying at a specific place, you could definitely take a look, see if you have connections there. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, sometimes people who have worked there recently can be maybe a little bit more forthcoming. So that's another thing to take a look for. And then in general, within a field, there are often companies or organizations where there's just a general sense or a common wisdom of who pays more, who pays a little less. I mean, you always, as with all sort of common wisdom, you want to take that with a grain of salt. But overall, we're looking for patterns, not necessarily a single figure. And if you're anything like me, just not really great at holding numbers in my head and remembering the specific amounts. So keeping a record of what you find as you speak to people individually can help just sort of help you look for these patterns. So those are a couple of key resources, both online and in person, for your research. And once you've done this research, what do you do with all of this? And we're going to talk more in a moment about specific times you're going to be asked to name a number in the process, but just a couple of general principles here. You want to go, if you're feeling pretty solid, if you feel pretty confident, you can ask for the higher or even above the range, sort of test the waters. If you're less certain of the range, you could name a number, or you could actually at the outset name a slightly wider range, right? And then if you are completely taking a stab in the dark, you have not been able to find very much information at all, or you're finding wildly varying information, or perhaps you're switching, you might be switching fields and have had difficulty digging things up. You could, and I say cautiously there, work from your salary at your past or current job. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There's a pretty big movement against using prior salary as a basis for setting the new salary, both from the employer side and the employee side. But if you've got nothing else to go on, you could definitely start there. But definitely, no matter what, unless you're going from a one field to another where the second field pays significantly less, you generally speaking would like to at least ask for a little bit more than what you have been making. Okay. And then again, just before we go into the stages, a couple of negotiating principles. So one key thing is, again, going to this culture of the guessing game and the lack of transparency. Let's challenge this by, whenever you have the opportunity, ask, what is the usual salary for this position? What is the company's typical range for this position? I think that sometimes in all of this strategizing, we lose the power of that simple, basic question. And sometimes people will answer this. Maybe even often people will answer this. Sometimes they won't, but it's one of those, it's part of both advocating for yourself and making this whole thing simpler, as well as the larger challenge to this culture around negotiation. And then, another common piece of general negotiating principles is you do need to go in knowing what is the lowest acceptable salary to you. I don't mean in absolute terms, but within what you know about the range, are you going to be able to live on the, what's that lowest point? And so this is where you do want to do a little bit of thinking about your expenses and your own financial picture. And if, and just being realistic within the given range from what you found out, where are you going to have to walk away? Where can you make it not work? And all of this is very nuanced. Whenever I give a general presentation about this, I always want to add, a million footnotes because every situation is different. You need to be flexible. There are, there's general principles, but there's not a lot of hard and fast rules about this. It's not, different suggestions are not always going to work either for you or for the situation you are in. So stay flexible, use your judgment, and don't be afraid to ask. Part of, really my education over the last 8 years since I started career advising has come primarily from you all, from working individually with alumni who've been made offers, and hopping on the phone and getting the particulars, having people forward me emails. They said this, how do I respond? So our body of knowledge as advisors comes from each of these nuanced specific situations from which we try and draw examples and sort of common information, which we're passing on to you today, and are also happy to talk to you about one-on-one as you head into it. And this is one of those examples, I've mentioned this before, where this can sometimes be time sensitive. So always best to hop onto Handshake or call the office and make an appointment, take the first available one. But in a case like this is where you want to shoot myself or Beyond Barnard at barnard.edu and email and say, help, I have an offer on the table, don't know what to do, don't know what to say, or have a question. And this is one of those cases where we'll try and sort of a relatively new development, I'd say, over the last 5 to 10 years. I'm getting the internet being unstable. Hopefully I didn't freeze up for too long. So answering salary questions early in the process. So the earliest it can happen, and this has become more common, although not universally common, is being asked right in the online application, what are you looking for? Or asked to include that information in a cover letter or something else. So this is where having done your research ahead of time can help you. So again, if you've got if you've done some good research, you can make a highly educated guess. You can go ahead and name a range. You can add, sometimes in an online application, it forces you to put in a number, not a range. But sometimes there's text allowed. If you can work in somehow, either in the area where they ask the question or closely following in a text box, that you are flexible, that can be helpful. Right. And one thing that to try and take people feel really pressured about this sometimes. And so one thing that I always want to, very often the number can be revisited. People see this as the first step in negotiating. And sometimes an employer will try and treat it that way, but not always. And very often, once you actually get to the point where they're making you the offer, you can reopen it. And one of the easy things to say is, since I filled out the application, I've been able to do a little bit more research, and I think I underestimated, what the typical range is, and I would actually like to ask for higher. So it's awkward, but not impossible. Right? But one of the general principles is early in the process, you are trying to avoid naming a number early on. I'll give you some scripts for that in the next slide. But again, back to general principle, you're in the power position once they have selected you, right? Before that, you're sort of one of many, several, a few. And so you want to avoid getting into the nitty-gritty of the negotiation until they've actually made you the offer. And then just a note that starting in Massachusetts in 2017, 17 states have made it illegal for employers to ask about your salary history. So very often in an online application, or sometimes it's asked for in a cover letter, to say, give us your salary history or what you're currently making. And so check your state. A lot of the northeastern state, and I guess bluer states, you would say, have made this illegal. A couple of the redder states have made it illegal to make this illegal. I think Wisconsin jumps to mind. So check the status. Even where it is illegal, sometimes either by carelessness or intent, employers will still ask about this, either upfront or not. And if you are able to push back on it, either verbally or just leave it out, do that and talk about it later if you get pushed on it. So speaking of which, okay, let's go, there we go. Okay. So during it also sometimes can come up during the interview process, sometimes as early as the first round, the phone screen or the, whatever that first conversation is. And one of the points I wanted to make comes up in the online application as well is a lot of times when it's asked early in the process, it's not so much about negotiating as it is about screening for people who have a really unrealistic expectation of the salary. So in other words, they're trying to screen out someone who is looking for way more. And from that point of view, it's not a bad thing. It sort of keeps you and them from wasting time. And often you could do the same. I wouldn't do it right up front, but if you, for instance, I would maybe go through the first round of the interview, but if you start to get a sense that, it may not pay as much as you think, you could bring it up as well and say, I would be looking for this. Is that realistic? Should we keep talking? So there could be select moments when you want to bring it up. But if you do get asked during the interview process, what are you looking for? First, try and ask them what they have in mind. Again, back to that question, what are you offering? What is the typical range for this? And sometimes they'll say yes, and they'll give you the information. More often they'll say no and try and turn it back to you, at which point, again, name a range. Based on your research, add that you're flexible. And then if it does seem like the opening rounds of negotiation, you can try and put it off, right? And then it's one of these things, there's like a sort of little dance here. So if you're really feeling pressured, the idea here, as is down at the bottom, is you don't want to get to an impasse where you refuse to name a number. And so you can name a number, you can name a range, but you want to keep open that idea of flexibility. And let's talk about this further down the line, because then we get to negotiating once the offer is made. So here's where we get our power shift, right? So here's where they've picked you and they have a lot invested in you now. They've, moved you through the interview process. They've sifted through and chosen you as the best person. It's not impossible that they'll withdraw the offer if you try and negotiate. We've heard, I feel like in my 8 years doing this, I've heard of this happening 2, maybe 3 times. So it's unlikely, but it could happen. But generally speaking, they won't. And I think my second bullet point here is an important one, is that negotiation is normal. A lot of people try it. A lot of men do it sort of by default. It's just part of the expectation, not all. But another key point is that the person on the other side of the table might not be that great or comfortable with it either. So don't assume that everybody that you're talking to, whether it's the HR person or the manager or someone higher up in the organization, they may not be super comfortable or super skilled at negotiating either. So try and keep that in mind. It is true that there isn't always a lot of wiggle room. This can happen very often in the nonprofit sector, especially in the smaller nonprofits. Sometimes in a lot of the bigger corporate fields, especially in the early stages, there's not a ton of discretion. It's a very set salary range with particular steps, so there isn't always, the general wisdom out there is always try and negotiate, but there are times when it's not going to get you too far, that it's very clear that the salary is set. There's not a whole bunch of wiggle room. But it can definitely be worth trying. Basic question. I was looking for closer to X. Is that a possibility? And often it is, and they'll get back to you or they'll talk to you about it directly. Sometimes they say no right up front. Right. Another really important piece of information is no matter how excited you are about the job, no matter how good the offer is, maybe they offer you the job and name a salary that was higher than you were looking for. But no matter what, you do not say yes right away to the offer. You can be as excited as possible. You can say, I'm thrilled to get the offer. That's great, wonderful news. But you always want to circle back. You can ask for a written offer. Not everybody plans on sending one. But most places will send some sort of formal written offer. And then this next part varies a little. In some cases, they're going to push you to get back to them the next day or in 2 days, but in other places, it's the norm to take, maybe up to a week to get back to somebody. So you have to, again, use a little bit of judgment and nuance there. And this is the time, whether you've got 24 hours or a few days, to do some more research. And this is actually a good time. I've had people do this for me at Barnard. They'll call me up and say, hey, I actually, I'm in the final rounds, or I got an offer, does this sound right? Sometimes I can answer, sometimes I can't. Depends on how close I am to the process. But it's not a bad time to circle back to contacts and say, hey, they're offering me this much. What do you think? Do I ask for more? Do I take this and be happy, etc.? And then this is also a good time to reach out to us and say, I've got an offer in hand. What do we think? So one piece of advice, and this actually, I've heard a couple stories, this actually more from the real estate market, is, you can keep going back and forth, but it usually becomes clear after a round or two where things are heading. Are you heading for the middle? Is it headed more, higher? Is it headed a little lower? So you don't want this to go on and on. I think the more rounds, the more you haggle back and forth, the more likely they are to stop the process and move on with somebody else. So you want to be careful. But I think it's important to, if it's ending up closer, if it looks like there's not a lot of wiggle room, if it looks like the salary is going to be lower than you were hoping for, you need, part of your final decision is, can I concede? Can I live with this? Can I take this? If it feels really bad, really wrong to take it, if you can't concede gracefully, then don't take the job. Or if you feel backed into a corner and you have to take the job, you need to think that through, talk that through, so that you can live with it, at least in the short term. But one thing that can happen, and this goes back to where, the company or organization might not have a lot of wiggle room, they can't really come back with that much higher an offer, is that is a good time to talk about other things. So if they've turned you down on salary or given you just a tiny bit, you can ask about some of these other things. And everything in this list is negotiable. I italicized the last two because those things, well, actually working from home right at this moment in the COVID, and with so many people working from home, you probably could bring it up, but I italicized those because these are sometimes easier to negotiate once you're in the job and have sort of proven yourself, or sort of, give them a little bit of a track record. So, but I've had people negotiate around a lot of these different things. The training and conference opportunities, particularly, in the nonprofit sector, where there might not be a lot of flexibility on salaries, but they sometimes have a separate budget for professional development, and that's definitely something to ask about. And it's particularly as you advance into your career, asking for additional vacation or sick days. Again, that can be a very formulaic thing that there's not a lot of wiggle room on, but especially in the private sector, there can be a fair amount of flexibility on that. And especially if you have come from a place that had a pretty generous vacation and paid time off policy, sometimes you can parlay that into more salary, or get them to match that. So that's definitely something I've seen people go back and forth. And then another point about living, conceding gracefully and living with a lower salary than you want, is to set up a time for a salary review. This is something you definitely, you can't get it you generally wouldn't get it in any sort of legal writing. There's generally not contracts around this, but it would be if they are willing to say, yeah, let's talk in 6 months, let's talk in 12 months, there might be more room then for us to make the argument to move you up in salary. But remember that, and put that in an email. And then when the 6 or 12 months has gone by, you might need to be the one to take the initiative to bring up that conversation. Okay. All right. And then finally, some future opportunities to negotiate, speaking of 6 to 12 months. So once you get there, once you're on the job, you definitely want to get some information. Or actually, sometimes this becomes part of the job offer. It's in the packet of benefits. And, so definitely don't skip over the part, any information you're given about what is the process. Are raises given annually based only on cost of living? Are there merit raises? Are there bonuses, etc.? And are these tied to the performance review schedule? So you want to find out, and if it's not clear from the benefits package, or if it's not in that initial packet of information that you get, you can definitely ask about it, and educate yourself. So it's illegal to ban people from talking about salary, but a lot of workplaces will discourage it, some actively, some not so actively. But, try as you get to know people, as as you are longer at an organization, see if you've got opportunities to gather general or even specific information about how much people are making. Can be helpful, just all adding for it. And then again, as the opportunity arises, ask for other things, either in an annual review situation or in the moment. There's a couple of sub bullets here about, especially if you're doing additional work. This is something that it's common generally. It's sometimes called job creep. And I feel like strong, Barnard, competent women are very prone to this, especially in the nonprofit sector, where you're good at what you do. And so they ask you to do more, and they ask you to take on more without offering or discussing a new title or additional money. And then I think it also particularly happens in current times with layoffs and furloughs, that we're all, a lot of people are being asked to do more without the opportunity for a pay raise or a promotion. So, so you can ask for the title bump, you could ask for more money, but you also can ask for some of these other things that could make your life easier. Personnel, some opportunities for trainings, all of these things are possibilities and things to keep in mind. So even if your company doesn't have, or your organization doesn't have a regular process for this, you can ask for a raise. It's a normal thing that people do, even if it's not something you've done a lot in the past. You want to make sure that, though, that you're, not just asking for the raise for the sake of a raise, but you need to both stay in sync with the market value and tie it to the fact that you have been doing strong work for the organization. One rule of thumb I've heard is that, asking for a raise, especially early on in your career, asking for a raise when you've been there less for a year is it can be somewhat off-putting to people, that they're, and again, if we go pre-COVID to a more employees market, there, was a lot of feeling of like, hey, my friends are moving ahead faster than I am, I'm going to ask. But you have to, again, sort of gauge your organization, gauge your manager. And then of course, now we're all living through a different reality at the moment, right? So you just want to keep the timing in mind, though. All right. So super stressful times, not a great time to approach your manager. And you want to be cognizant of the cycle. If you are asking off cycle or in the middle of a cycle, you should have a strong reason for doing that, right? And make sure that you follow all the existing processes. But another thing that's come up a lot, and I found this especially with alumni working in smaller organizations, startups, there may not be a set schedule. There may not even be an HR person. And so part of what I've coached people on before is how to take the initiative. How do you get that conversation going? How do you ask for a meeting specifically to talk about salaries or promotions? Generally speaking, if you haven't talked salary and you've been doing well, doing excellent work, then that's a good time to bring it up. And here's a number of suggestions on how to do that. You've got some inside information now. And if in the meantime you've joined some of these professional associations, have access to that, that can be helpful. And you do want to prepare, you want to have a sense of what you're going to ask. Okay. In general, the research shows that couching asks in personal financial needs is not as successful as making a business case. So, and the personal can sometimes specifically backfire for women. So you can make it personal in the sense of, your professional self, right? And what you've accomplished, what you're offering the organization, what value you're bringing, but you want to keep it more on the business side than the personal. So a couple of things. If they say yes, great. Sometimes they can say yes and then things can get stalled bureaucratically. So, keep an eye on that. But if they say yes, that's great. You want to, if they say, we're not sure, we might have to wait, I need to check with X, Y, and Z. I've definitely worked with people where there's been this sort of intentional or unintentional delaying tactics. So you want to either from the outset, or if things drag on too long, ask for clear next steps. And if you do get a flat no, take some feedback, ask for feedback. What should you be focusing on? What can you do to get a raise or a promotion? If they can't tell you that, or if they keep putting you off, that's when you want to think about, looking elsewhere. And one of the things that's interesting is that it's often easier to get a higher salary by moving to another organization than it is staying. There's sort of just again, intentional or unintentional bias for people who already work there. They tend to sort of get into the system, and whereas somebody coming from the outside, they'll often be more receptive to giving a raise. So something to think about. Okay, so a couple of final thoughts. Back to the knowledge is power. I think that's just one of the key things I've learned over the last 8 years. The more you know about the market rate, the better able you are to make that case for yourself. Right? And think about it again in terms of how can you do your best work. We all know this part. You can either be confident or you can act confidently, right? If you don't feel 100% confident, they'll fake it until you make it. But it is an uncomfortable area for people. And so you're not going to probably be completely comfortable negotiating. It comes up rarely enough that we usually don't get enough practice at it. So push yourself outside your comfort zone. These couple of books I mentioned are on the older side, but they're some of the earlier works on women and negotiating, and their titles changed between 2000 and 2009. I think it's an interesting one from Women Don't Ask. Sort of, this was more of the case for the research of why women avoid negotiating, how it hurts them, to a more pragmatic, okay, now that we know that you're uncomfortable or anxious about it, how can you actually strategize and do a better strategic job? There's a lot of subsequent research. If you Google women in negotiating, there's lots of books and articles and webinars and TED Talks, and there's a real wealth of information around this topic if you're interested in sort of in the things I didn't talk about, sort of the the research and sort of knowing more about the nuances of how this plays out, and then actually being able to practice and do some role playing and things like that. So speaking of that, there's an additional resource. There's a platform, a website called Negotiable that is the work of Daniel Ames, who is a professor at the Columbia Business School. He's a social psychologist and an expert in negotiating, and he's a huge advocate for practicing, role playing and practical strategies, practicing as much as possible. So we have access to that site by invitation. So what I'll do is take your names and emails and pass them along to Brianna on my team, who will send you a link. And it's you can sort of work through exercises. There's lots of resources and information and different strategies there, which could be helpful. We're also trying to set up a series with Daniel Ames for the fall or possibly winter. It would probably be like a three series that would give you some of this hands-on practice and role playing. And then, as I've mentioned before, Ask a Manager has opinions on most of these topics. And if you look under salary, she's got a lot of questions, she's got a good news section where people sort of write in with their success stories. And then, as always, questions looking for advice. So she can be helpful on this as well. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions, but we've only got one more session, and I want to make a little pitch for this. So managing your ongoing professional development, on the one hand, it's sort of the logical end of our journey that we've taken, from career exploration to resumes to job interviews to negotiating. It's the happy ending to the story. You're in a new position, and what do you do next to sort of keep an eye on your professional development as you move forward? But I think actually also a lot of you who are feeling stuck at the moment, a lot of you who've been taking the webinar series are actively looking for jobs, actively looking for new employment. But there's also a number of you who are not actively looking, but thinking about future steps. Possibly if things weren't so dire at the moment, you would be actively looking, but right now you're sort of holding steady in your current job. And I think a lot of the things we'll talk about next week about the the other title for it. This is the subtitle, Managing Your Ongoing Professional Development. The actual title is Grow Your Worth. How can you make yourself more valuable in your current position in terms of, setting you up for future possibilities. So I hope a lot of you will join in live or listening to the recorded session. As always, you can make an advising appointment now or once the series is done. Just a heads up that I'm going to be off a couple of days next week and then the full week of the 8th. So if you want to meet with me specifically, it's probably going to be the second half of August, and a couple of other team members are taking days here and there. So it might be a little harder to get an appointment than it has been, but then things should, then the students are going to come back and we're all going to get busy. So, but do what you can, get an appointment. And again, as always, if you have something time sensitive, let us know and we'll try and fit you in for a shorter, earlier stint. And if you have any issues with Handshake or anything else, you can always reach out to our general email and get a quick response for assistance. All right, so I'm going to exit. I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to take a look at the Q&A. And as usual, zoom through as many as we can before. Okay, so let's see, Q&A. Okay. Excellent. Okay, great. So good question. Can you please discuss the differences as you see them for consultants? Interesting. I think a lot of the same principles agree, apply, and you need to do the same research, I think, is helpful. It's going to probably be a little bit trickier, but it is probably going to be more by asking people. But that same idea, like how much do our consultants in this area for this type of business around this particular type of subject matter, what is the going rate or what is the range of the going rate? How does your experience? Do you think challenging because I think there are fewer sort of online resources than there are. But and I'll put in a plug. This is actually, I've seen this pop in Facebook groups. So there's specifically the Bold, Beautiful Barnard alumni Facebook group. This is a really and a great private group. People out there. And so I've definitely seen people say, hey, I've been asked to edit, or I've been asked to consult on a project, or I've been asked to do X, Y, or Z, and I live in X city, how much should I, charge? And, sometimes you get direct opinion. Sometimes people will refer you to people in their network to ask about. So in terms of the research side of things, I think it can be a little more challenging, but it's still important to have a sense. And similarly, what can you what do you need in terms of income? And then I think that a lot of the same principles, you can certainly ask them, what do you typically pay consultants? Or you can take the initiative. Here's what we. So, but I think a fair amount of this still applies. I just think in some cases it's a little more challenging for consultants, and it's a little bit more based on networking and word of mouth because there are fewer resources. There used to be a website called Lance Rate, as in freelance rate, but that seems to have gone away. I think the time before last when I presented, I checked and it was no longer there. But Google is always your friend here. You can always say, just pose the question: how do I set rates for consultants? Go from there. So next question, would you please spend some time going over how to seek a review, not annual, with HR in a large company? I accepted offer with a very different level of responsibility than a few months in my job became fairly equivalent to that of my direct supervisor. They didn't adjust my salary. And when I discussed with my supervisor, not helpful, told me to go to speak to HR if I had concerns. That meeting is pending. Excellent. All right. I mean, not excellent. That's, again, intentional but unintentional, but it's a fairly typical of the buck. So you've got a pending meeting with HR. So what I would do to prepare is, definitely prepare to ask the question at, ask the question at the outset. Am I, what's the salary range for, this title I'm in for this level of responsibility? And am I in that range? And then what's the process for being brought up? So I would have a range in mind, but also ask them, and then have that business case. You want to document, even if you don't necessarily have to show them a written document, but you want to have organized your points ahead of time. So you want to be able to explain how your role has increased, and back it up with a little bit of salary research from competitive or similar firms, and basically make the case that you are below market rate and you want to be brought into market rate, and what's the possibility there. And then be very cognizant of them passing the buck back to your supervisor, or trying to delay things and say, okay, well, so when could we set a time to talk again? What are next steps, etc. Just try and be as proactive, nicely and diplomatically, but as proactive as possible. How do you ask someone in the nonprofit field about salaries? Won't it appear like you don't care as much about the cause? Yeah, this is classic. This is a classic thing, both as you're networking and actually even once you get in the organization. There's this sometimes explicitly stated and often implicitly stated idea that we're all in this for the cause, not for the money. I think you ask just like you would anybody, but you don't lead with that. So if you're if you're doing an info interview with somebody in the nonprofit, you want to start with talking about the cause, talking about what got them into this work, what they love about their organization, what's hard about it. Sometimes they'll actually bring up the fact that part of what's hard about it is the salaries are low. But it's fine to say, look, I'm really excited about the work. I'm excited about this type of organization, but I'm worried about salaries, and want to be realistic about salaries and my expenses. What can you tell me? And just go ahead and ask and see if they've got information. I think, again, in a networking situation, I don't think it should put someone off or make them think you're less committed to the cause just because you ask about money. Certainly the organization itself shouldn't be put off by that. So I would say I'm in the favor of asking, and advocating. Just don't lead with it. Are recruiters, HR allowed to ask you for your current pay stubs as proof of your current salary? So no, if you're in one of the 17 states that makes it illegal to ask about it, and certainly to ask for proof. So if you just Google, I think the way I checked to make sure it's still 17 states, it's kind of leveled off at 17 over the last year or so. So I think I just said, I just Googled, illegal to ask about salary. And there was a list. There was a list of which states allow it, which states don't. And then, as I said, I think it's Wisconsin where some cities or counties have made it illegal to ask about past salary. So if they don't offer salary information up front, is it better to ask what the usual salary is before they ask for your range? You could if you're comfortable, but I would, because the advice is generally don't bring up money, until later in the round. You could go against that, but I think it's more, if they ask you what your range is, it is okay to ask them back and say, oh, well, what is the usual range for this? What's your typical range? And then see what they say, if they bat it back to you or if they give you some information. If you've not been in a full-time job for a couple of years, how can your past salary inform what you're able to ask for, especially if that salary is higher than a lot of companies are willing to offer? Let me make sure I understand that. If you've not been in a full-time job, how can your past salary? Yeah, well, so, okay. I think in general, you need to put aside past salary information temporarily while you research the current market rate. So it could be that you're changing fields. It could be that the field is changed and it's paying more, or it's paying less. It could be that you have been in the market for a while and into higher salary than what they're offering. That can be sort of a bias against you. I'm getting the unstable. I might have frozen for a moment. So sometimes they can assume that you're looking for, more, and that can be enough to make them not want to interview you. That's part of that screening process. So, but yeah, in general, the focus is on the market rate. You can use your past salary as an indicator, but not if you find that it's very different from the current market rate where you're looking. If you already provided a salary range in the initial phone screen and after doing more research realize the range may be slightly higher, how can you revisit that number later? Can you renegotiate the number if you've already provided a range and they present an offer that falls within that range? So I think it's worth a try. If you find out basically that you've undersold yourself, you just say that. You don't say that exactly. What you say is, I know that I mentioned X amount in the initial inquiry. I've had the chance to do a little bit more research about salaries and sort of the market rate for this. And now, was hoping to go up to, and then, mention something a little higher. Is that a possibility? And you just take it from there. Sometimes they're going to say no. Sometimes they'll say maybe. Sometimes they'll say yes. But I think it's definitely worth asking. And I think if you let them know that you've done more research, or now that another phrase would be to say, now that I know more about the jobs and the responsibility, or now that I understand the title better, I think X would be closer to the market rate, or would be closer to what I was looking for. So, okay. If salary itself is non-negotiable, what are other things to consider? Does it make sense? Yeah. So there was a slide about that, I think. And, definitely. And definitely sometimes when I do negotiating, counseling, advising with someone, we actually will strategize. We'll look at that list and we'll run the scenario. So if they say no on salary, what's your next most important thing? Is it a bonus? Is it paying for the cost of moving? Is it being able to go to the annual conference every year, and then strategize from there what else you can ask for. Am I unfrozen again? I think I'm bobbing around. Hopefully people can still hear me. Oh, and we're past time, so I'm going to just answer a couple more and then get going. If salary itself is non-negotiable, what are other things to consider? Okay, just ask that. I've had companies refuse to provide a written offer letter until they have reasonable assurance that you will accept the offer. However, I don't think it's appropriate to verbally accept an offer if you don't have a full holistic view. I agree. Total Comp looks at the org, and if stated as such, how do you push back and request a written offer without, I can't tell if there's more. Okay. Oh, without verbally accepting. Yeah, this is part of the dance. I would say that what you want is to get them, bonus, equity, pay time off. So if they don't want to give the official written offer letter from HR, what you want to do is get the main points verbally. So, you're on the phone, you're in a Zoom call, or, maybe person, and just write down what they say. All right. Or ask your questions, and, note where they may know for sure, and other areas where they may be unsure. And then what you do is you write it up, not into a legal thing, but and so what you say at the end of that conversation, let me think about this, take it under consideration, and get back to you. And then what you can do is write it up
Hi, everyone. Christine will be right back. I think her connection just ran out. I think it was a little bit unstable, as she said, but she will be back momentarily. It's Lacey from Alumni Relations again. Christine, it says Zoom bumped her out. She's not able to get back on. I'm gonna send her the last few questions from the Q&A. Feel free to email her as well. It's cshen at barnard.edu. So we hope you will be able to join for next week, which is the last session in the series. Thank you all for your patience, and I will send her your last questions. Thank you.